Hi, I'm Cautex, and recently Warcraft logs introduced rankings for Torghast runs. I think that the rankings with the most competitive potential are the Solo Twisting Corridors DPS rankings, and in this video I'll be going over my latest personal best of just over 33,000 DPS, which is currently rank 1 for all warriors and rank 2 amongst all DPS specs. I'll be going over how I was able to achieve this much DPS, ideas on how to optimize the run further, and why I think that this leaderboard has the most competitive potential compared to the other Torghast leaderboards, and I'm also going to be trying to kickstart that competitive potential by offering a prize to the subscriber with the highest ranked run. I'll be going over all the details later in the video, so keep watching if you're interested in that, and with the introductions out of the way, let's get started. I'll talk about my gear, talents, covenants, and soulbind shortly, but first, this run is built around Heroic Leap and Ancient Rubble. So at the start, I enter Torghast and see if my first anima cell has any of the important anima powers that I'm looking for, and if it doesn't, I leave and then try again. The anima powers that I'm looking for are Glory of Skyhold, which gives Heroic Leap 2 extra charges, Blaze of the Tidescorn, which makes Heroic Leap cast Piercing Howl where it lands, Gargamar's Shattered Hand, which makes Victory Rush reduce the cooldown in Heroic Leap, Smoldering Inertia, which increases your damage by 100% for 6 seconds whenever you leap or charge, or Lens of Elshiver, which does arcane damage every single time you crit. That or any of the other really strong anima powers that exist, but are not really a requirement for the build. I end up getting lucky and getting Smoldering Inertia, which is an absolutely vital anima power. That said, it's not a big deal if you don't get it from the first anima cell, but if you don't have it by floor 6, and it's not one of the options in the post-boss anima cell that has the 3 epic anima powers, then I would highly recommend restarting a run if you're looking to get a really strong rank. I then proceed to let the mask slip and reveal how dumb I actually am by dying to the first trap. Anyway, as previously mentioned, this build revolves around using the Ancient Rubble anima power, which makes Heroic Leap do ticking AoE damage wherever it lands. You can get multiple stacks of this anima power, and also there are multiple sources of percent damage modifiers that you can acquire that will attach to Heroic Leap. Smoldering Inertia doubles your damage and also applies to the Ancient Rubble, and then with Resonant Throat Bands, you could get up to another 90% damage modifier on top of that, which can automatically be applied with Blades of the Tidescorn. The damage of Ancient Rubble is not subject to the AoE target cap, which then allows you to make really huge pulls and do a ton of damage. Once you have acquired those anima powers, the only limiting factor is how often you can use Heroic Leap, which gets offset by Gargamar's Shattered Hand and Glory of Skyhold, which will make it so that you can basically constantly use Heroic Leap. Now, it's worth noting that at the time of recording this video, because these rankings are so new, there are only 2 ranked warrior parses for Twisting Corridors, myself and Saraline from BDGG. So while doing better than one of the best warriors in the world does feel nice, it's not a particularly notable accomplishment because there's not a lot of other warriors posting runs. Well, I was incredibly lucky and got both Ancient Rubble and a Glory of Skyhold this early in the run. It's worth mentioning that Glory of Skyhold really isn't all that powerful until you get at least one Gargamar's Shattered Hand. And this is because you're going to be using Heroic Leap more or less on cooldown, so it isn't all that likely that you're going to be having those extra charges available to use. The trick to solving the color code chest quickly is to identify the button that changes all 4 colors, or as I call it, the 4 change button. Then once you have that chain unlocked, you're going to solve for the 3 change button, then the 2 change button, and then finally the 1 change button. The way that I do this is that when I come up to the chest, I click on a random button and I see how many options that it changes. If it's not the 4 change button, I then want to click on one of the buttons that didn't change colors. So for example, if I clicked on a button and it was the 2 change button, that tells us that the button that changed colors but we didn't click is the 1 change button, and the 3 and 4 change buttons are one of the 2 that didn't change color. So if I then click on one of those and it turns out it was the 4 change button, that tells us that the other option was the 3 change, so that I can then solve for the current button, which is again the 4 change, and then now I know where the 3 change button is, so I can solve for that, and then the 2 change, and then the 1, and so on and so forth, and then the chest is open, grab the anima cell and get out of there. At this point of the run, I now have the 2 harder to find anima powers that this build relies on, but somewhat ironically, I don't have either of the easier to find anima powers that make these rarer anima powers meaningfully useful. That is, I now cast Heroic Leap whenever I land, but I don't have Resonating Throat Band, so it doesn't make the mobs take extra damage yet. And I can have multiple charges of Heroic Leap, but I don't have any way to get those extra charges without holding on to the leap because I don't have Gargamar's Shattered Hand yet. Side note, I'm abbreviating that anima power to GSH from now on because I've literally spent 30 minutes just trying to pronounce that anima power the 4 times that I've said it so far in this video, and at this rate, I'm going to lose my mind before I complete the commentary. So if you hear me say GSH, I'm talking about the anima power that you're seeing on your screen right now. Also, I let the mask slip again and show off how dumb I actually am. Luckily, I didn't die this time, but oh man, did I feel incredibly stupid with my decision making going through these traps. Early on, personally, I think that it's worthwhile to spend the extra time necessary to open the locked chests that don't require you to pick up keys. The key pickup chests are sometimes worthwhile, but it really depends on the location of the chest and also the location of the keys. So if you get one that requires a lot of backtracking, then it is a waste of time in my opinion. While you could systematically go through all of the options for the binary lever chest, it's pretty slow, so I honestly just flail about clicking levers randomly until I find the right combination. To pretend to be smart for a moment to make up for the incredible amount of stupidity that I displayed earlier, the most optimal way to solve these chests would be to use something called the binary 4-bit gray code. Basically, a gray code is a way to count numbers in binary such that each successive number only differs by 1 bit. So basically, what this would mean is that you will only need to click once per combination as opposed to needing to click multiple times if you wanted to count sequentially using normal binary. Conveniently, gray codes are cyclical, so it actually doesn't matter what the starting positions of the levers are, just as long as you know the entire gray code sequence. Now, I highly doubt that Twisting Corridors runs are ever going to be so optimized that solving the chess in this way would actually matter, but if you are an absolute god gamer and want to flex on us mere mortals, that's one way you could do it. I grabbed Notched Axe Head here because I'm anticipating getting GSH at some point, and also it'll help with Phantasma gains if I get any Pleonexian commands. Now, ideally, I would like to have more Phantasma going into floor 3 so that I can buy a Ravenous Anima Cell. The reason for this is that since I got the Fracture Chambers as my first tile set, I could use that Ravenous Anima Cell to get the Marrow Scooper Anima power, which would allow me to get a ton of Phantasma and let me buy pretty much most, if not all, of the Anima powers off future vendors. Now I finally have enough time to talk about my talents, soulbinds, conduits, and gear, so let's do that. While Arms definitely has the stronger defensive cooldown in Die by the Sword, Fury seems to do better AoE damage than Torghast, so I did this run as Fury. And I also used the standard legendary of Signet of Tormented Kings. The only modification that I did to my normal gear set was that I'm using the Hungering Destroyer trinket over File of Putrefaction. My reasoning for doing this was that the logs were showing that Gluttonous Spike was doing more DPS, and it also helps break the urns, which is kinda nice. Now, I recently switched to the Night Fate Covenant, so I was able to take advantage of how strong the Karain Soulbind is, and for conduits, I used Destructive Reverberations as my Potency conduit, Inspiring Presence as my Finesse conduit, and Stalwart Guardian and Brutal Vitality as my Endurance conduits. I had done my initial runs with the Indelible Victory Endurance conduit, but keeping a beefy Ignore Pain up is sometimes a requirement depending on what floor sets and anima powers you get, and Brutal Vitality really does help a lot with that. I did try runs using Naya as my soulbind because getting all that extra mastery and stamina seemed really good, plus the extra movement speed granted by Swift Patrol would help minimize downtime, which can have a massive effect on your run. The only problem is that Burrs is terrible in Torghast because often mobs die before the Burrs actually latch onto the mob, and so they get wasted. Now, alternatively, I could have gone Poisons, but Poisons does barely any damage, and while it would allow you to use a second potency conduit, survivability does really matter in these runs because you're trying to maximize your damage with the anima powers, so it's hard to say in that regard. Something that might be worthwhile that I didn't try, because I only thought of it right now as I'm writing this script, that actually might be a strong contender would be to get Stay on the Move and Poisons instead of the default of running Run Without Tiring and Burrs. Sure, it's only a single potency, and it's Poisons, which is, again, pretty garbage, but the out-of-combat movement speed that you gain, and also the cooldown reduction on Soul Shape from killing mobs, might make up for the damage that you lose by not taking First Strike with Karain. I'll probably have to try that sometime. That, or maybe you could try and you could let me know your thoughts on it in the comments. Another option would be to actually take herbs, because believe it or not, Bloodthirst and Victory Rush can proc the haste. And we do use those two abilities a whole lot over the course of this run, and percent haste is really nice, so maybe there's something with that too. Anyway, I'm gonna stop thinking out loud. Long story short, Naya has a lot of hidden potential, but I went with the obvious strengths of Karain. Now, the specific covenant that you are doesn't really seem to matter a whole lot because Saraline did their run as Necrolord, which is generally considered to be the lowest DPS covenant for Fury Warriors, and they were able to put up a run that was not easy to beat, and as previously mentioned, it took me a number of attempts before I was able to successfully beat their run. As for talents, I took Fresh Meat as my first row talent. I've seen a lot of people running War Machine instead of Fresh Meat, which makes a lot of sense because we kill a lot of mobs, so it's going to give us a whole bunch of rage, and also that movement speed is really nice. but I had more consistent results being able to have that immediate rage, which synergized nicely with Karain and First Strike. Though, ideally, you should be on the lookout for that anima power that would allow you to run both. Next, I took double time because more charges is more better, and typically by the end of the run, I'll have the indelible victory anima power notched axe head, or both, so having victory rushes available shouldn't be an issue by the time it really matters. Then, despite being Night Fae, I chose to go with Massacre. My reasoning was that most of the time, I'm not going to be doing multiple rampages on a single target, because they're going to be dead before I get the second one off. So I'm going to be basically constantly at one frenzy stack. And if I get Voracious Culling Blade, having Massacre is going to make it easier for me to get to the 50 executes so that I can have it always be usable, and then at that point I would swap to Frenzy. Realistically, I should probably just stay as Frenzy or potentially even grab Onslaught, though if I did grab Onslaught, it would likely only be useful earlier on in the run. I went with Warpaint just because it's the safer option. Now, the faster option would definitely be to take Bounding Stride, but by the end of the run, you're always sort of on that razor's edge of whether or not you're going to get one-shot by things or not. I took the safe option of Warpaint. The last 3 talents are the standard for Fury. I went with Cruelty, Bladestorm, and Anger Management. Later on in the run, once you have a bunch of Rage Generation anima powers, it actually might be valuable to take Frothing Berserker, because with the 100% increased rage gain, and potentially also having Recklessness up the entire time, and if you have Whirly Blades, which causes your Rampage to cast Whirlwind, you're going to get the rage from the Whirlwind, and if you have a bunch of Thorium Hairpin anima powers, then Frothing Berserker plus Thorium Hairpin could in theory mean that you might actually be able to just spam Rampage. But that's another thing that I'm going to have to try out. Once I kill the elite at the portal to the next floor, I backtrack and go on a bit of a hunt looking for more anima cells and phantasma. I do this because the next floor is floor 6, which is a vendor and a boss, so ideally I would like to have more phantasma so that I can afford to buy all of the plundered anima cells and potentially also a ravenous anima cell or maybe some of the targeted anima powers available. I should have dropped the chain that was on the portal side so that when I go to the floor I could come back up right to the portal and I wouldn't have to use the chain, then use the Venari teleport thing that you could buy, which was added recently. So that's a bit of an unnecessary time loss. So let's talk about these Warcraft log rankings. When Warcraft logs created the rankings for Torghast, they made 3 primary types of ranks: speed, execution, and DPS. The speed ranking should be pretty obvious, and it's ranked by how fast you can complete your run. Execution is ranked by assessing who can take the least amount of damage over the course of their run, and DPS is ranked by the total amount of damage you did divided by the total length of the run. These rankings are spread across all the various wings of Torghast, and there's also rankings for runs of all the various group sizes. Personally, I think that solo DPS runs are the more interesting ranking because speed runs are generally just about running directly to the end of a floor, killing that floor boss while engaging as few packs as possible, and then repeating that till the end of the run. Execution runs are generally about finding ways to cheese mechanics so that you never have to take hits and then, well, just don't take damage. But DPS runs, on the other hand, incentivize you to actually interact with what makes Torghast, and that is the anima powers, as they can massively increase player power. Additionally, because the DPS is measured in terms of total damage divided by total time spent in the instance, many speedrunning style optimizations can be useful, but you also need to balance it out with actually hitting mobs to do damage. Finally, I think that Twisting Corridors has the best competitive potential for DPS runs because the number of floors that you have to complete all but ensures that you're going to have access to all of the anima powers that you're looking for with the build that you want to use. That makes these rankings a function of the specific anima power build that you choose, your ability to balance choosing DPS anima powers and survivability anima powers, your ability to prioritize and manage your time spent doing non-combat things, and your ability to deal with the various combinations of floor mechanics. And that's all on top of your ability to just do damage and not die. Golden Idol is pretty nice because it allows you to make better decisions around what packs or mobs that you want to kill if you're not planning on full clearing the floor. Though Stonerot Studs actually make a noticeable difference in your survivability to physical damage, so while on paper it seems like it's a pretty garbage anima power, it's not actually one that you should really feel all that bad about taking, assuming of course that you're not choosing it over some other really strong DPS anima power. At some point, I'm likely going to get a weak aura or add-on that auto-accepts the "Are you sure?" pop-up windows, as that would probably save somewhere to around 30 seconds over the course of an entire run, which might not sound like much, but that's 30 seconds of doing literally no damage that could be completely removed. Also, I should have used my plundered anima cells before pulling the boss here, and I have no idea why I didn't. Another small optimization that could be made is to try and pull these bosses closer to the exit portal before they die so that you don't have to run as far to get to the anima cell and then go to the next floor. Something else that I should have been doing was using Drums of Ferocity, which given how long this run takes, I would have been able to use it a number of times. Gibbering Soul is probably the most valuable epic anima power for survivability, so if you have to choose between that and the 80% defensive cooldown reduction, pick Gibbering Soul. This is because you're practically always going to have enough stacks of Unbound Fortitude and Soul Remnants to have 100% uptime on your defensive ability, even without the cooldown reduction. And on the later floors, you're really going to want to have both your defensive ability and Ignore Pain rolling at the same time. One area that I think I can massively improve at is my cooldown utilization. There's a trade-off that needs to be made between using your cooldowns as much as possible and saving your cooldowns for when they're going to be most valuable. I tended to save my Ancient Aftershock for the floor boss or for certain huge pulls, but ultimately I think I could have used it way more often over the course of the run. The same goes for Recklessness and Bladestorm, though I think that I was a little bit less bad at managing those cooldowns. A really small side note about my UI is that I track my secondary stats at the top of my screen. However, as far as I'm aware, unlike all of the other secondary stats, there's no API command that returns your current versatility percentage, and instead you can only really ask for your current versatility rating. This means that all of those versatility anima powers that I'm grabbing won't show up in that number, but all of the other secondary stat related anima powers do actually show up in those texts. I think that it's generally best to make sure that you kill all of the tower sentinels on the floor so that you can get rid of the aura that they apply, which reduces your damage done. Though there's almost certainly a breakpoint at which the extra time spent running around trying to kill the tower sentinel will cause you to do less DPS overall than just letting the aura persist on you. Going back to talking about cooldowns for a moment, I was also especially bad at using Soul Shift. Sometimes I wouldn't use it because I was saving it for a later situation when in reality I could have just used it both times and it had been fine. Other times, I would use it and then pretty much immediately get close enough to a mob to start combat, and so I would break out of soul shape so that I could get first strike. This segues nicely into talking about movement and how movement can be optimized in these runs. Ideally, you should be taking the most optimal path to the end of the level. In this case, the optimal path is the one that allows for the most time spent doing maximum damage, has the highest rate of anima powers per time spent, and has the least time spent not doing damage or getting anima powers. Breaking this down a bit, maximizing time spent doing what I call maximum damage means that you want to do as many pulls as you can that will allow you to do the most damage that your anima power build is capable of. For this Ancient Rubble build, that means that you want to do as many pulls as you can that have a lot of mobs, and try to avoid doing smaller pulls of 1 to 2 mobs. Maximize the rate of anima powers gained per time spent, I've touched on a little bit already. You want to get as many anima powers as you can, but some of the ways that we can acquire anima cells take a long time to get to the payout, and frequently that time that you're spending getting those cells is time that is spent backtracking, or at the very least, time that you're not doing damage. Minimizing time spent not doing damage or getting anima cells in practical terms means reducing the time that you're spending running around to your next activity. Finding ways to minimize the time that you spend just running around is extremely important. Now, one of the obvious ways that you can minimize this time spent running around is to minimize the distance that you need to travel on the floor. While every floor in Torghast is procedurally generated, there are a finite number of tile sets to each floor type, and there's also a finite number of ways that you can connect each tile. This means that while it's not possible to know beforehand the exact path you should take, with practice you can develop an intuition of the patterns in each of the floor layouts, so that when you see a particular tile, you can know the most likely places for anima cells to be located, and also the most likely path to the exit. Another way of minimizing time spent running is to simply run faster. This is why you see a lot of warriors taking War Machine in their non-twisting corridors runs. Now, there's also a number of anima powers that increase your movement speed, so you could get a Ravenous Anima Cell and then use it on a Marat to get its harness. If you get lucky and see the rare horse, then there's an anima power that it has that is also a mount. There's an anima power that increases your movement speed when you're running near walls or ledges. And then there's also various anima powers related to the Covenant movement speed abilities for Venthyr and Night Fae. All of these anima powers are excellent options and things that you should be looking out for and strongly consider grabbing depending on what your other options are. But there's also an anima power that increases your movement speed by 40%, but at the same time reduces your max HP by 15%. This makes it a very risky trade-off, but if you're confident in your ability to not die, it's absolutely worth grabbing. Now, I get this anima power as an option twice on this run, and both times I do skip it. Two other sources of movement speed that warriors commonly forget are the fact that Enraged grants you 10% movement speed for its duration, and if you go Single-Minded Fury, you get an extra 5% movement speed all the time. Also, Given that Single-Minded Fury gives you another source of a percent damage modifier, while it's normally less DPS than Titan's Grip, I can actually see a world where it is better in Torghast because of the exponential growth caused by multiple sources of percent damage modifiers. That said, I'm not going to claim that it's viable until there's more testing done on it, but it's just an interesting thought. Also, because this build prefers to make larger pulls, spending time killing packs of 1 to 2 mobs is not a particularly good use of my time, and ideally I should be trying to kill these mobs while running to other packs, or another option would be to tag a bunch of smaller packs and then kite them to a spot where I can break line of sight, such that all the mobs including the casters are going to run directly to me, and then I can AoE them down. Doing this gets complicated by the fact that our survivability is very much tied to our ability to be hitting mobs with Bloodthirst and Victory Rush. And we also don't have much in the way of ranged interrupts. I mean, sure, we could get Stormbolt, but then we lose double time, so that's not likely worth grabbing. And we could also use Intimidating Shout, but it has a pretty long cooldown, so you could only really use it on one pack of casters when doing a pull like this, which is far from ideal. Now, Heroic Leap, Charge, and Soul Shape can allow you to get out of range of the casters, but depending on the specific mobs that you're pulling, you might have to take a hit from their initial cast. In practice, tagging a bunch of small packs, outranging, then line of sighting them is probably the optimal way of doing things, and you should be doing this whenever you can. But the hard part is deciding how big of a pull you can make without dying. Because of my stupidity on the earlier floors with the traps, I wasn't really confident in my ability to do these sorts of pulls, and therefore you don't see me doing them. I suspect that people's ability to break a floor into a number of discrete pulls with as many mobs as possible, as opposed to a long string of pulls with just a couple mobs, and to do this without dying is what is going to distinguish the truly great Torghast runners. Here I finally get my first rank of GSH and can start farming heroic leap charges by trying to stagger the deaths of mobs so that I can basically spam Victory Rush and get a bunch of its cooldown cut off, and also some Phantasma because of Pleonexian Command. That said, our ability to always have a leap available without really focusing on it doesn't really happen until you get your second rank of GSH. Once you get your third rank, it's pretty much harder to actually use up all 3 of your charges of Heroic Leap than it is to get to 3 charges, because your Victory Rush is going to reduce its cooldown by 30 seconds, and you're going to more or less be spamming Victory Rush so that you don't die. I think that it's always worth it to talk to the NPCs and try to help them out, because there's generally very low risk with a decent reward. Most of the time you're going to come across the thing that they're looking for on your way to the next floor, or it's just a few seconds out of the way. If it's really far out of the way, then yeah, you should probably skip it unless you're feeling really lucky. But in this scenario where you talk to them and then don't actually help them out, then really all you've lost is that half second that it took to talk to them. Later on in the run, if you get the choice between percent Phantasma gain and a flat amount of Phantasma, it may be more valuable to just go with the flat amount of Phantasma. If you wanted to min-max this beforehand, you could actually predetermine the average amount of Phantasma you expect to gain per floor, then multiply that amount by 25%, and then multiply that by the number of floors that you have remaining. If the flat amount of Phantasma is more than this value, then go with the flat amount. This breakpoint would likely only happen on the last couple of floors, and also by then you're typically swimming in Phantasma, so while it's technically an optimization you can make, it's not all that practical. Well, Bladestorm does a massive amount of damage. Its problem is that you can't use Victory Rush while Bladestorming, so I frequently have to cancel Bladestorm much sooner than I would ideally like to. Though, at the very least, I get to keep the Avatar and Recklessness procs from Signet of Tormented Kings, so I never really feel all that bad about canceling my Bladestorms. Lens of Elshiver is an extremely powerful anima power, but its drop rate is pretty weird, at least for me it is. That's because in the vast majority of Torghast runs that I've ever done, I never see lens as an option. But on runs where I do get a lens, I usually see it multiple times during that run. This is exemplified in this run as I get a total of 3 copies of lens, which does a ton of single target DPS, because while its tooltip says that it's based off spell damage, in Torghast, your spell damage is actually equal to your attack power, so it really scales off AP. And since I'm running Karain, I have a ton of crit chance, so it procs constantly. And then add on top of that Smoldering Inertia and Resonating Throat Bands, it gets to the point where at the end of the run, Lens will be critting for nearly 100,000 damage. Something that you may not have noticed is the fact that when you're in a vendor bubble, you can change your talents. This expands the potential optimizations that can be made because it's possible that there is some build that is most optimal on the early floors and a different build that is best on the later floors, and that swapping between one and the other midway might be better than just committing to a singular build. That said, because Warcraft logs tracks the talents that you use, I'm not really sure how Warcraft logs would be able to show this in the logs. And it could be possible that this actually would invalidate the ranking, but I don't really know, and that's another thing that will need to be tried out. I grab Refilling Elixir of Life off this vendor because I think it's one of the most valuable survivability anima powers, especially for its vendor price, and I think you should definitely be looking to get one over the course of your run. And speaking of survivability anima powers, ideally you should grab the minimum number of them that you need in order to complete the run without dying. How many of them and which ones you prioritize depend on what floor combinations you get, but in general, I'm personally looking to get the following survivability anima powers. First, I want to get 2 Unbound Fortitudes, as this is going to ensure that I can have 100% uptime on Enraged Regen. I'm looking to get Refilling Elixir of Life, as I previously mentioned. I think it's really, really valuable. I'm looking to get 2 Succulent Carpachios, because this will make your Ignored Pains much, much stronger, and it also scales nicely with the Stamina Anima powers. However, if I get Mortrigar or the Soul Forges, I tend to prioritize this a bit more, because Ignored Pain is our best way of dealing with spell damage. I'm generally looking to get around 2 Stonerot Studs. This is definitely a low priority unless I get upper reaches, as it makes a noticeable difference when dealing with the increased physical damage. If I get Soul Forges, then I'm definitely looking to get Flame-Starved Cinders, because it basically negates the Soul Forges debuff, but in order to get this, it requires a Ravenous Anima Cell, so I'm going to be prioritizing saving my Phantasma for that if I get the Soul Forges. I'm also generally looking to get at least 2 ranks of Hurricane Heart. This is very much a low priority, but it's offered a lot, so you're going to end up with a bunch of them over the course of the run, and it's also pretty nice once you get Fan of Longswords. I'm also looking to grab enough Stamina Anima powers so that I hit around 100,000 health, though this really depends on the specific floor combinations that I get. While I've mentioned it before, Gibbering Soul is really, really good, and it's not required by any means, but having it means that you don't have to spend Rage on using Ignore Pain, and instead can just use it on Rampage. Or at the very least, it minimizes the amount of Rage that you're going to have to spend, so it's a great choice if it shows up. I don't really care about getting Bladed Bulwark or Misshapen Mirror. I mean, sure, they're nice, but they're not meaningfully useful, so I don't prioritize them at all. I shouldn't have backtracked to kill the assassins that spawned. I really should have just kept running and line of sighted them so that I could kill them with the pack that I was originally running to. Here I get my first rank of Resonating Throat Bands, which is pretty unlucky, as usually I'd have at least 2 ranks of it by now. On the bright side, I now have at least one of all of the necessary anima powers for this build, so my damage is really going to start taking off. The reason why having both Resonating Throat Bands and Smoldering Inertia is so important is that all percent damage modifiers interact multiplicatively. So when I leap, I don't just get 100% from Smoldering Inertia plus 30% from Resonating Throat Bands for a total of 130% increased damage. It's actually 160% damage because really the math is 2, because that's 100% plus 100% times 1.3, which is 100% plus 30%, which will say 2.6. And then you would subtract 100% because that's how much damage you would do without these buffs, and so that says that we've gained 160% extra damage. Now, when I get my third rank of Resonating Throat Bands, when I leap, I'm actually going to be doing 2 times 1.9, which is 280% increased damage. So having multiple sources of percent damage modifiers increases your damage exponentially. I then proceed to get some good luck and get my second rank of GSH, and then right after that, I get another Anima Cell, and I make what might seem like a strange choice of grabbing 9% versatility instead of grabbing Voracious Culling Blade. I make this choice because at this point, the vast majority of my damage is going to be coming from Ancient Rubble, which would get buffed by the versatility. On top of that, most of my GCDs are going to be filled by either a Rampage, a Bloodthirst, or a Victory Rush, so I'm not going to have a whole lot of opportunities to use Execute. And then, to top it all off, versatility provides extra survivability against all damage sources, which is really helpful. If I had to make this choice much earlier in the run, such as being on the first or second floor, I would have probably leaned more towards taking the Voracious Culling Blade. If a Lord of Locks starts whirlwinding, they do a ton of damage, so the best solution that I found is to use Intimidating Shout to break the channel. Also, you should make sure to interrupt the lockdown cast that they do. While it's not a top priority, getting Fan of Longswords is an incredibly useful anima power because it helps a lot with your AoE DPS, and it will increase your survivability from healing caused by Hurricane Heart. I choose to grab the damage proc anima power here because my gut feeling is that it's more DPS than grabbing the haste, but I don't have any math or analysis to back up this gut feeling, so I could very well be wrong. That said, I also spent so much time on this chest that I'm not even sure that it was worth trying to get either of them this late into the run. I finally get an Unbound Fortitude, which will help my survivability greatly, but even with having over 40 soul remnants, it's still not enough to achieve 100% enraged regeneration uptime, so I'm still going to need to find another. After this vendor, I'm at rank 3 GSH and rank 2 Resonating Throat Bands. This means that all that's left is getting one more rank of Throat Bands, and I'll be at peak strength, at which point my goal would be to try to make as many big pulls as possible and kill as many mobs as possible. After killing the boss, I grab Battlelord's Ultimatum, which grants the Anger Management talent. This allows me to switch to one of the other final row talents, and I take Reckless Abandon instead of Siegebreaker, simply because it doesn't require me to press extra buttons. However, taking Siegebreaker would have probably been the much stronger choice because it would add yet another source of a percent damage modifier, and since I also have Meat Cleaver and Fan of Longswords, there's a really high probability that I'll be able to immediately cleave that Siegebreaker whenever I leap in. In theory, if you got lucky, you could save a Ravenous Anima Cell just to use on a Lost Treasure so that you can get to the secret room that has a bunch of anima powers. But in my experience, it's almost always far more trouble than it's worth, so I just kill them immediately. I didn't pick up the little orbs that he dropped that give you Phantasma because this is the last section before the final boss, and I'm pretty loaded up with percent Phantasma gains and also Pleonyxian commands. And as such, I'm pretty confident that I'll be able to have enough Phantasma to clean out the last vendor without it. And speaking of Pleonyxian Command, if you weren't already aware, how it works is that it grants Phantasma for each hit of Victory Rush. This means that a cleaved Victory Rush could potentially cause up to 4 hits, and each one of those will grant Phantasma. So earlier on in the run, when you need Phantasma the most, if you have a Pleonyxian Command, being smart with your Victory Rush usage to maximize your Phantasma gains can be the difference between affording an extra anima power or not at the first few vendors. If you're desperately low on Phantasma and have Pleonyxian Command, it's possible to farm these cauldrons that spawn skeletons. Also, if you're able to get a collection of these cauldrons on one of the last floors, it could be possible to cheese the DPS a little bit by rotating through each cauldron with Heroic Leap to farm damage. Though this is quite rare, and I'm also not entirely sure that it'd be worth it, because it depends on how quickly these skeletons are spawning. Crown of Obstinance is a really good survivability option if it shows up for you, especially if you get Mortrigar. two small optimizations that you see me do here is that I use Heroic Throw on the Maw Rat to pull it individually. I do this so that I can use Victory Rush on it, which will then give me a charge of Heroic Leap, which I can then use on that large pack of skeletons. After that, you're going to see me charge the Urn, which I'm again doing so that I can use Victory Rush and get a charge of Heroic Leap, and then use it on a much larger pack. Optimizations like these are one of the reasons why I enjoy these runs, because they reward you for being able to fully utilize all of the tools that warriors have. With Lords of Torment, you should interrupt their first cast and then Spell Reflect the second one. Their channeled cast does a ton of damage and will help kill them much faster if you Spell Reflect it. The only downside of this is that the damage isn't counted as yours in the logs. Ethelium Weights is a massively strong anima power because it interacts multiplicatively with your soul remnants, which means that you're going to have just an incredible amount of strength. At this point, I really should have stopped wasting my time by looting mobs because I have more than enough Phantasma that I'm not going to be able to spend at the remaining vendor. This run was unusual in that it took me until floor 15 to be able to achieve 100% uptime on Enraged Regeneration. Typically, you're going to have the opportunity to get that second stack of Unbound Fortitude much earlier, and this is something that is absolutely vital because without it, you could very easily get one-shot depending on the combination of floor tile sets you get. This is also one of the primary reasons why I've been grabbing so many Bound Soul Remnants. The decision to grab or skip Bound Soul Remnants is an interesting one. You see, while multiple sources of percent modifiers interact multiplicatively, stacks, they add up, which makes sense because otherwise it would get really weird really quick. And this means that the relative gain from each additional stack decreases as the number of stacks goes up. So, for example, the relative change in your DPS going from 0 to 1 stack is going to be much higher than the relative change of going from 30 stacks to 31 stacks. Then there's the consideration that after a certain point, getting additional remnants is not going to help your uptime on Enraged Regeneration because you're already at 100% uptime. So it seems obvious to me, at least, that there is some point at which it's no longer efficient to spend the time needed to release one of these bound remnants. That said, I really have no idea exactly when this breakpoint would be, and I'm also not entirely sure about how to go about figuring that answer out. What I can say is that if you get the upper reaches tile set, then it's almost certainly worth it to skip the bound soul remnants that have those extra locks that you would need to click off, because that just takes way too much time. If you have any ideas on what the optimal way to deal with the bound soul remnants is, let me know in the comments, because I'm genuinely curious. I bought a Ravenous Anima Cell on floor 15, but then I never ended up using it. Since the floor type is the Fracture Chambers and I already have the Marrow Scoop or Anima Power, I should have probably used the Ravenous Anima Cell on a Skeleton to get the Skeletal Ward Anima Power, which gives you a skeletal minion that will fight for you. It doesn't do a lot of damage, but it's definitely better than nothing. Tremor Beast Heart is another insanely powerful anima power because there's literally no downsides to it. And again, it interacts multiplicatively with Soul Remnants and also Ethelium Weights. Tremor Beast Tusk is also pretty good, but I don't like the fact that it has the knockback component because it'll knock mobs out of Ancient Rubble. So let's talk about kickstarting the competitive potential of these runs by having an actual competition. And I'll buy the winner of this competition any one of the $10 pets or toys from the in-game shop that they'd like. So here's the rules. Whoever can post the highest solo DPS Layer A Twisting Quarters run by the end of the night on April 30th, 2021 wins. But there are a couple restrictions. 1. You need to be a warrior. I want there to be more warrior runs, and so this competition is only open to warriors. 2nd, you need to be subscribed. I mean, it's pretty simple. You just gotta click a button. 3rd, you need to post your highest DPS run as a reply to the pinned comment in this video. The way that you should do this is to post how much DPS you did and also the Warcraft logs report ID. When you look at the URL to the logs, the URL says warcraftlogs.com/report/ and then it has a bunch of random numbers and letters. Those random numbers and letters are the report ID. You need to include that in the comment so that I can find your logs and prove that you actually did that much DPS, and you should only put the report ID so that YouTube doesn't try to eat your comment because you had a full URL in the comment. If you post a run and then improve on it, I ask that you simply edit your comment with your new best run rather than posting a new comment just to make it easier for me to sort through all the entries. 4th, unfortunately, you're going to have to be on a North American server. And the reason for this is because, as far as I'm aware, I'm not able to buy toys for EU players without an EU account. I'll be looking into this, and if I can do this, I will update the pinned comment to state that EU players can enter. Once the April 30th deadline has been reached, I'll go through the comments and find the best run, and then I'll confirm your identity and have you pick the toy or pet that you want from the store, and then I'll give you that toy. Now, just because I enjoy doing them, I will be continuing to do some runs myself, but I'm not going to be eligible to win my own competition because I'm not some sort of rat-human hybrid. So anyway, if you hadn't yet been persuaded to try your own Twisting Quarters runs, maybe this incentive will help. And I wish you the best of luck in the competition. On floor 17, you're going to be at your maximum power, so you should be trying to farm as much damage as you can on this floor, because it's usually going to be your last opportunity to do AoE damage, depending on what final boss you get. This means killing as many mobs as you can with as large a pulls as you can manage. I, of course, did a poor job of this and instead decided to do a lot of small pulls. I should have been much more aggressive with my heroic leap usage here to get this rare mob down a lot faster. Frostbite Wand is a bit of a trap because unless you can kill the mob that you hit in under 4 seconds, it's basically guaranteed to heal back up to full, which then you have to kill all the way again, making it so that mobs live a lot longer. That said, taking the mob to 50% health does seem to count as damage on details, so assuming that you could live through the bosses for all that extra time, it might actually be worth it. I played it safe though and just went with the crit chance. This is about the point in time that I realized, oh yeah, this is the last floor. I should probably try and do bigger pulls. I grabbed Protective Phantasma here, thinking that maybe that plus Pleonixian Command will provide a modest amount of survivability for the last boss, and then once I locked in my choice, I immediately realized how dumb of an idea that was, and regretted not taking Bloodstained Whetstone. Getting this ooze as the last boss is pretty much the best case scenario compared to all the other bosses that I could have gotten. It's not a particularly scary boss because it doesn't hit that hard, and its cast is pretty easy to interrupt, and even if I miss it, it's not going to kill me. And then on top of that, it spawns a lot of ads, which makes my Ancient Rubble damage skyrocket. Again, I could have optimized my time and movement by bringing the boss closer to the exit portal so that I could exit the run immediately after the boss died. And that completes the run. I've linked to the Warcraft logs report in the video description if you want to analyze it in more detail. I'm also really looking forward to seeing how high of DPS you guys are going to be able to achieve for this competition. And of course, lastly, I just want to say thank you for watching this video and subscribe for more.